want to welcome you to Gardening in the Mountain presents Tomatoes, Problems, Diseases, and Pests. We are so glad that you are here with us today. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Roudebush. Phil is an Extension Master Gardener here in Buncombe County and also the committee chair for the compost demonstration site at Jesse Israel and Son Nursery and Garden Center at the Western North Carolina Farmers Market. Phil will be talking to us today about the problems, pests, and diseases we encounter growing our beloved and most treasured garden tomatoes here in the mountains. So thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Allison, and welcome everybody. Good morning. My name is Phil Roudebush, and I'm a Master Gardener volunteer here in Buncombe County. I've lived here for about 5 years. I moved here from eastern Kansas, where I lived for about 25 years and was also an Extension Master Gardener volunteer. And I've lived and gardened in 5 other states before coming to North Carolina. As Allison mentioned, tomatoes are one of our most popular and beloved home garden vegetables, and I've grown tomatoes in a number of different locations over the years. No matter where you live and garden, tomatoes can be a challenge to grow successfully. And those of us that are growing tomatoes have had plants in the ground or in raised beds or containers for about 8 to 10 weeks, and problems are beginning to emerge. Hopefully this class will cover the most common problems, diseases, and pests that you'll encounter this growing season. I now live at a townhome. Previously, I had about an 1,800 square foot vegetable garden, so I miss a large vegetable garden and have to do most of my gardening of vegetables now either in my flower beds or in containers. These are the 3 tomatoes that I am growing this year. I got transplants from a fellow master gardener, James Wade, and I want to thank James for providing those. I'm growing in containers on my back deck. I'm growing chocolate stripes, which is an heirloom variety that I have not grown before, but I like growing kind of multicolored tomatoes. The 5-star grape tomato I have not grown before is a hybrid. And then Rutgers. Rutgers has sort of an interesting history I'll just share with you. It was developed in the 1930s by Rutgers University, hence its name, and they worked in conjunction with the Campbell Soup Company, who had a tomato research facility. It became the primary tomato that went into Campbell's soup for decades. At its peak, it was considered to be the most widely grown and popular tomato variety in the world. Then in the 1960s, commercial growers wanted to use mechanical harvesters rather than hand-picking tomatoes, and the Rutgers variety has a relatively thin skin and was not suitable for that, and so fell out of favor. But it's still an interesting heirloom. It has an interesting history. It's another one of the tomatoes that I'm growing this year. I wanted to mention a couple of other resources that are available to you beyond the class today. One is certainly resources through the North Carolina Cooperative Extension. We're fortunate to have the Mountain Horticulture Research and Extension Center near to us in Mills River, and hopefully some of you have visited there. They do have their own website, mountainhort.ces, which stands for Cooperative Extension Service.ncsu.edu. And if you go to that through your web browser, go to that site, in the search function, type in tomato, you'll get all the tomato resources, including a tab that says pubs, which are the publications and fact sheets. For many of the conditions we're going to talk about today, if you want some additional information, that's really a good place to go. The Mountain Horticulture Research Center has a field day each year. I went to it last year, and they have another one scheduled for this year, although this year it will be a virtual field day or a field tour. It's on Thursday, the 6th of August. It begins in the early morning and runs for the morning. It'll be the first time they've ever done it virtually. And I would encourage you that if you're interested in kind of what some of the more recent research around tomatoes and tomato varieties and the disease conditions that they're researching, this would be kind of an interesting thing. I plan to attend virtually. Some of the information I'll share with you today, I actually picked up at the field day last year. The other resource that I think is very valuable is Purdue University, through their plant pathology department and their horticulture department and extension agency, has come out with an app that you can put on your smartphone or tablet called the Purdue Tomato Doctor. In full disclosure, I'm a Purdue University graduate, so I can tout my alma mater a little bit. It really is very valuable that if you want a quick and easy place to look at pictures and descriptions of some of the things that we'll talk about today and other conditions, it's a good, handy, quick reference and would point you in that direction as well, an app that you can easily download. So today we're going to divide our presentation into two sections, biotic and abiotic diseases or problems that affect tomatoes. Most of us, when we think about disease problems, we think of biotic. And of course, biotic, the term bio is Greek for life. So these are going to be things that affect tomatoes that are basically living organisms. We really think of these when we see a problem with tomatoes or virtually any plant. We tend to think of biotic problems first: viruses, bacteria, fungi, the nematodes, which are small microscopic worms in the soil, insects, mites, and then other types of parasites. We have a tendency to kind of focus on those. But what we're going to start with today are the abiotic situations. And of course, the prefix a means without, so these are the non-living situations that causes problems with tomatoes. And we're going to start there because I think they're often overlooked and we have a tendency to focus on the biotic conditions. Over the last 10 years, we've really got to think about handling diseases and problems with what is called an integrated pest management or IPM mindset. And in the IPM mindset, basically what we want to do is always diagnose the problem disease or pest first, make an appropriate diagnosis, and then in ascending order, use cultural and mechanical or physical interventions first, followed by biological alternatives if they're available, and then really only using chemical treatments as a last resort. Again, because we have a tendency to think about biotic problems first thing people often ask is, what is the insect or fungus that is causing the problem and what can I spray on my plant? That is a high level of intervention and oftentimes highly toxic. We really should be thinking about more benign preventive measures that focus on cultural and mechanical physical aspects, and that's why we're going to cover those first. So tomatoes are very important to have a good balance between what we see above ground and what's below ground. Tomatoes are very reliant on a very extensive root system, and it's very important that you have a good balance between what you see above ground and the roots that are below ground. And that really probably started 8 to 10 weeks or 3 months ago. If you didn't grow your own seedlings when you picked out a transplant, oftentimes the problems begin here because you really want to purchase or to grow a plant that has a good balance between what we see above and below ground. And so you really want a short, dark green, compact, squat plant because you want that balance between the plant and that root ball that's in the container. And oftentimes I go to garden stores and tailgate markets and I'll see these long or very tall tomato plants that obviously have much more growth above the container than the roots that are in the container itself. Tomatoes' roots need to establish a symbiotic relationship with what we call mycorrhizae. And these are the symbiotic fungi that live in the soil. Tomatoes will do best when they establish a good root microbe relationship. This is the proverb I always like to use. A gardener often looks up, but a good gardener looks down. And what I mean by that is we need to be very concerned about what's going into the soil or what's happening in the soil and what's happening with the root structure of that tomato. And as we're going to see, many of the problems that we deal with are because we have an imbalance between the foliage above the ground and the root structure in the soil. Tomatoes are heavy water users. The general recommendation for a tomato that's in the ground is to have 1 to 1.5 inches of either rain or irrigation per week. My containers are actually on my concrete patio in back and get full sun for about 6 to 7 hours a day. I find that I literally have to water them every day to keep them from drying out. The situation may differ depending on whether you're in a raised bed, a container, or the soil, but in general, we say about 1 to 1.5 inches per week. One of the problems that we see is that people have a tendency to over fertilize tomatoes and many other vegetable crops. And so I'm going to give you some kind of general recommendations. First key is to not over fertilize. And in fact, we have problems with over fertilization much more commonly than we do with under fertilization. So there's really 4 primary times when you want to fertilize that tomato. The first is when you transplant it and use a transplant or starter solution. There are a number of these that are commercially available, or you can make your own. Commercial products work very well. If you have not gotten a soil test previously or don't know what the pH of the soil is, you'll probably want to incorporate some lime. Our soils have a tendency here to be acidic, and oftentimes our native soils have a pH of less than 5. The optimum pH for most tomatoes is somewhere around 6.5. So bringing that soil pH up to around 6.5 can be very beneficial. I've given you in the handouts some kind of general recommendations on how much transplant starter solution and lime to incorporate at planting. Then the second time to fertilize is about 1 to 2 weeks after fruit set. On my container tomatoes, I had fruit set about 2 weeks ago. I fertilized this week, in fact. Then again, 2 weeks after first picking, and then 1 month later, which would be about 6 weeks after picking the first ripe fruit. Generally, what is recommended is a balanced fertilizer like 888 or 10-10-10. Again, having a soil test and knowing specific recommendations is even more helpful. One of the problems that we saw probably about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and you may still be seeing, is what's called physiological leaf curl. This is a physiological process that we see where the leaves curl along their long axis, and this is because of poor water transport into the leaves. The leaves are curling up to try to prevent water from transpiring out of the leaves. And again, this is because of a top versus root imbalance. Again, the roots have not developed to the point where they can adequately transport water into the tomato. So this often happens in the spring summer shift that happens in the June time frame, may have happened about now too. And the good news is that it's a temporary condition. Once the root structure catches up to the top, things will straighten out. One of the other issues that we have this time of year is that we have lots of flowers, but no fruit. This is a common question that we get this time of year. Even though the flowers have been pollinated, and again, most tomatoes are wind pollinated, there's no fruit. There's really 3 environmental temperatures that we need to consider when we're thinking about this problem: 55 degrees, 75 degrees, and 95 degrees. Air temperature must be greater than 55 degrees for 50 continuous hours. So I think about 2 consecutive days for fruit to set. Even if the flowers have been pollinated, fruit will not set if air temperature drops below 55 degrees anytime over about a 2-day period of time. So one of the concepts I want you to think about is not only is how hot it gets during the day important for tomatoes, but also what does the temperature fall to at night. As an example, if you think back a little over a year ago, in June of 2019, on the 13th of June, overnight, it got down to 46 degrees. And on the 14th of June, overnight, it got down to 49 degrees. So both of those under 50 degrees. So we got a lot of questions from people, especially if they put their tomatoes in relatively early and they were flowering. I've got all these flowers and nothing is setting. There was a good example in the middle of June last year where temperatures got low enough that it wasn't a problem. At least now, within most of Buncombe County, the lows at night are in the kind of mid 60s to upper 60s, so we don't really have to worry about that too much. The other nighttime temperature is if it's too warm. So if the air temperature is greater than 75 degrees at night, that will also reduce fruit set. Again, that isn't probably too much of a problem here. Usually the temperature gets below 75 degrees at night, but if it doesn't, if you have several very warm days that lead to very warm nights, that can be a problem as well. Then finally, the daytime temperature, if the air temperature is over 95 degrees during the day, that also reduces fruit set. And again, that isn't much of a problem here, but as I said, I gardened in Kansas for 25 years, and there from the middle of July to the middle of August, we would frequently have long periods of time where it would exceed 95 degrees, oftentimes more than 100 degrees, and not get below 75 degrees at night. So we had the double whammy of being very hot during the day, not cooling off at night. And so it could sometimes be a real challenge to get fruit set in tomatoes. But again, for us, it doesn't get up over 90 degrees very often. Usually it goes ahead and cools off into the 60s. So usually that's pretty good. The biggest problem we're going to have is we put the tomatoes in very early. We may have that temperature that falls below 55 degrees at night. The other biggest issue with flowers but no fruit is that we're providing too much nitrogen to the plant. This can happen with all of the flowering vegetables like peppers and eggplant and squash. As an example of this, my sister-in-law lives just outside Atlanta. She's having problems this year with her peppers and squash. And I asked her what she was doing. Every time she watered, she was using Miracle-Gro. Miracle-Gro can be very good in that it's a high nitrogen, water-soluble fertilizer. It can also, when used inappropriately, provide too much nitrogen. In this case, what happens is if you use a high nitrogen, water-soluble fertilizer, too often, plant then will put on lots of foliage. It will go ahead and produce lots of flowers, but because it's being over-fertilized, sees no reason to go ahead and produce fruit. So again, over-fertilization can be a problem. So in general, if we're talking about a typical tomato, not a cherry tomato, grape tomato, if it's fertilized flower and the environment is appropriate, we'll go from flower to golf ball sized fruit in about 3 weeks. Then a mature size in the next 3 to 6 weeks, and color will follow. In mine, I've got now fruit on all 3 types of plants and looking for them to achieve mature size here over the next 3 to 6 weeks. Their physical problem could be hail damage. We don't have much of a problem here in Western North Carolina, but again, this was a big problem that I had in Kansas for a number of years because even thunderstorms during the height of the summer would produce a lot of hail. Most of our thunderstorms break apart or not as intense as you see on the Great Plains. If you suspect that that might be a problem, you can cover up tomatoes to prevent that physical damage. Sunscald is a problem that we have. Again, to have successful tomato production, we need to have 6 to 8 hours of sunshine a day, but especially if tomatoes are exposed to very intense temperatures in the late afternoon or evening, you can get sun damage to both green fruit, to ripened fruit. As you can see here, it can happen with peppers, squash, eggplant as well, and you can sometimes get damage to the leaves. Location can be helpful to try to prevent late afternoon intense sunlight, and also it's important to try to maintain lots of good leaf coverage so that the leaves of the plant will protect the fruit. Cracking is something that's been investigated in tomatoes for a number of years, and it's still not completely understood what causes cracking. As we'll talk about, there are some varieties of tomatoes that are more resistant to cracking. And so I've shown here on the picture a number of different types of cracking. It can be concentric, it can be very unusual. For many years, it was thought that maybe this was due to the fact that the tomato that had a very thin skin, that would contribute to it. And it's now known it's more about the different varieties have pliability of the skin of the tomato. The things that are thought to contribute to it are excessive water, either excessive watering that you're doing or excessive rainfall. Again, over-fertilization is found to have a correlation with cracking, so another place where over-fertilization may be detrimental. Wide temperature fluctuations between nighttime temperatures and day temperatures are thought to contribute to it. And again, sun exposure. These are some of the varieties that have been found to be fairly resistant to cracking. Most of these are hybrid varieties, Jetstar, Celebrity, and we'll talk more about the Mountain series of varieties. These are ones that at least have been shown in trials to be more resistant to cracking. Blossom end rot is a problem that we see fairly commonly. It's thought to be due to a lack of appropriate calcium levels in the fruit, and it's usually at the blossom end or the end of the fruit, the furthest from the stem. But because our soils are mostly calcium replete, calcium deficiency is not a big problem. If you've identified it in a soil test, then you may want to supplement with calcium. But in general, it's a water problem because the calcium is carried with water from the soil up through plant and ultimately into the fruit. So it's really a calcium transport problem or a water problem rather than a true calcium nutrient deficiency in the soil. And again, this can become because of inconsistent watering. And there's that old top versus root growth issue again. So again, if the plant starts out with imbalance between the foliage of the plant and the roots, it may ultimately catch up when the fruit is forming and end in blossom end rot. There's several things that can be done. One is, as I said, that usually calcium deficiency in the soil is not the problem unless you've identified that specifically via a soil test. Gypsum is calcium sulfate. It's about 20 to 25% calcium. You can incorporate that in the soil if you do have a specific calcium deficiency. Also, calcium has a range of soil pH that really enhances its absorption, and that's around neutral. Around a pH of 7 is where calcium absorption is the highest. And again, many of our native soils have a pH of 5 or less, and so there may be adequate calcium in the soil, but the soil pH is such that that calcium cannot be taken up by the plant. And so in that case, as you see, the product on the left is lime. We talked about adding lime earlier when you do the transplant of the tomato plant. So doing a specific soil test and bringing the pH up around 6.5 is a good midpoint for tomatoes. If we correct the acid soil, that will enhance the availability of calcium. Then the other product that you'll see that's commonly recommended are foliar sprays. This is a picture of one that's a calcium to be sprayed on the leaves. Unfortunately, there hasn't really been a lot of research done specifically with foliar sprays and blossom end rot in tomatoes or other vegetables. There has been research done in fruits like apples. Again, good calcium levels in apple fruit is important for their normal development. So again, there's been some evidence that foliar sprays may be helpful in fruit trees under commercial situations. But for the home gardener, again, just realize that there may be lots of claims made for foliar calcium sprays, but there's very little evidence currently that they're effective for this. So the most important thing you can do is make sure that the soil pH is in that optimum range for vegetables, and make sure that you have a plant that you think will have a good balance between top foliage and root growth and provide consistent water. There are a couple of older varieties that appear to be very resistant to blossom end rot that have shown up in trials. One's called New Yorker and the other is called Old Brooks. These are not varieties that you're going to find typically in garden stores, so if you want to grow those, you're going to need to purchase seed and start it yourself. Walnut wilt is a problem that we see. Tomatoes are especially sensitive to this due to the toxin called juglone. It's found in block walnut and other related trees. A pecan is another example. This toxin can be found in the leaves, in the fruit hulls, in the bark, even in the roots, and can persist in the roots for a long period of time, even from a walnut tree that's been cut down. The tomatoes seem to be very sensitive to the toxin, so you need to make sure that if you're planting them, not plant them near either a living walnut tree or even a dead tree. I actually consulted with a preschool here in Asheville that wanted to start a garden for the preschool students and were interested in putting in tomatoes. There was a walnut tree that had been just cut down the previous year, and we recommended that they use raised beds and that they establish those beds outside the critical root zone for that tree. Even though it had been cut down, that toxin can persist for a long time. And then herbicide injury, both 2,4-D and glyphosate will damage tomatoes if you have spread, if it's being used in other situations. We get herbicide spread through the air. You'll get curling. It's different than the physiological leaf curl that we talked about earlier. So rather than get curling along the long axis, you can see here that you'll get curling around the edges and at the ends. Herbicide injury is something that if you see this kind of reaction pattern, try to find out if they have been used in the area. The last abiotic factor we're going to talk about is frost in the fall. Tomatoes are native to Mesoamerica. That means they were native to Central America, southern Mexico, and the northern part of South America. So that's why we can't grow them as a perennial like they do in their native environment. They're going to be killed with the first frost. My question that I'd like you to answer is, what is the average first frost in Buncombe County? These are data that I found from about the last 30 years up until about 10 years ago. These are the averages plus or minus for average first frost in Buncombe County. And you can see Asheville itself is somewhere around the third week of October, plus or minus 11 days. Enka, just out near where I live, just out west of town, you can see is very similar. But if we just go right over the ridge from Enka into Bent Creek, where the North Carolina Arboretum is, you can see a tremendous difference, almost a 10-day earlier on average. In fact, you can see that it could extend into late September. So again, you think of Bent Creek, you've got mountains on three sides emptying out onto the river. It's a place where cold air settles. So you can see that even within our county, we have a very geographically diverse county. The lowest point in the county is about 1,700 feet, where the French Broad River leaves the county and enters Madison County at the North County line. And the highest point in the county is Potato Knob, that's 6,400 feet over near Mount Mitchell. And we've got everything in between. So because of that, our first frost dates can vary tremendously. In general, if you want to think about typically the middle of October or up through Halloween is a good first guess. We've talked about the abiotic, and now we're going to move on to the biotic, or the living organisms that cause problems. The first group that we'll talk about are the vascular wilt diseases. There's really three of those: verticillium wilt, fusarium wilt, and bacterial wilt. They're called vascular wilt diseases for a couple of reasons. One is they will cause wilt. They'll look very similar to a plant that needs additional water. And they're vascular diseases because these organisms grow within the vascular structure of the plant. Remember, there's xylem and phloem, and water primarily moves upward in the plant in the xylem tubes. In this upper right-hand picture, you see here, this is a stem of a tomato that's been opened. This brown material here is the fusarium, which is a fungus growing within the xylem tubes. Basically, just think about the plumbing gets stopped up. So it's just like if the water line into your house gets completely obstructed, you're not going to have any water movement in the plant. So what we see is wilt, as you see in the lower picture. You may see some browning and curling of leaves as the edge of the leaf dies from lack of water. These are soil-borne diseases. We'll talk about the different things we can do to manage these, but again, two different groups of fungi and bacteria can cause these. They're all soil-borne. This, I think, is an interesting picture. This is a tomato that was suffering from bacterial vascular wilt. They've cut the tomato off and just stuck it in water. You can see these long strands of material that are coming out are just millions and millions and millions of bacteria. So again, when you cut this off, you lose the continuity of the xylem tubes, and by gravity, you can see all of this bacterial material just oozing out of the xylem tube. So it shows you really what's going on with these plants. The important thing is, again, chemical control. There is no chemical control that will be effective. This is within the stem of the plant and the plant tissues, and you really can't get chemicals there. We're going to have to really think about other ways to manage these. Probably the best thing is to use resistant varieties, and I'll talk about some of the general disease resistant varieties a little bit later. Crop rotation, sanitation, again, very heavy wet soils can enhance this. Solarization, fumigation, drenches, and cover crops, and we'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. Crop rotation is a basic concept for vegetable gardening that's very important. We won't spend a lot of time here, but simply say you can find resources that talk about a 3-year crop rotation, a 4-way crop rotation. The bottom line is, for these soil-borne diseases, you really don't want to grow the same vegetable in the same place year after year after year. Again, before I moved here, I had about an 1,800 square foot vegetable garden. I had a very large garden, and I had a 4-way crop rotation. As you see on the right, I would have the roots and tubers one year, and then the brassicas and the legumes. And I didn't grow a lot of onions or garlic, so that 4th year I would basically use a cover crop, or you could just allow the garden to be fallow for that year. Crop rotation is just a good basic concept. It may be harder to do if you have raised beds. You can certainly do that within containers as well. Soil solarization is a way to help eliminate the soil-borne diseases. If you're interested in soil solarization, there's a very good extension publication from the University of Tennessee. It's shown here. If you just type into your search engine UT extension and the publication number is W363, it's very helpful and goes through all the details. Soil solarization can be used with clear plastic or black plastic. Clear plastic is preferred. You need to take a part of the garden this time of year that you aren't using otherwise, till it up, slightly moisten it, and then cover it and allow the sun to penetrate the plastic and heat up the soil. It can be good for weed control. We'll talk about nematodes later. Can be good for some parasites and can also be good for fungal wilt pathogens. The only downside to soil solarization is that we have lots of beneficial microbes in the soil as well. Sometimes soil solarization will decrease the number of beneficial microbes in the soil, and that may be a negative thing. So again, if you're interested in this technique, I would refer you to that University of Tennessee publication. We can also use microbes, good microbes, to fight the bad microbes. These are a couple of products that are available that are basically soil drenches. You can make up a solution and incorporate that into the soil. Bacillus and streptomyces are bacteria that will have a fungicidal effect. Remember that many bacteria and fungi produce what we use as antibiotics today. The biggest problems with these is they're primarily geared for commercial producers. Actinovate, you can see here, is a powder. You're going to buy it and it's going to treat over 200 plants, and the prices are also a little bit negative. I just went on Amazon and these are the costs. I think most of us aren't probably going to be willing to spend $90 to $100 unless we have a commercial operation. If you can find these products in smaller quantities, they are available to use a beneficial microbe to help get rid of a pathogen. Cover crops I've used extensively. These are crops that are not harvested but are planted to improve soil quality and protect the soil from erosion. One that's been specifically looked at as a cover crop that appears to be beneficial against the soil-borne pathogen. That's the variety of mustards. The mustard family is in the brassica family, is a fairly large family. The yellow mustards, black mustards, white mustards all have compounds. They have what they call an allelopathic effect, and they've been found that if you grow that as a cover crop and then till or incorporate that into the soil, it has an inhibitory effect on a variety of soil-borne pathogens. I said in my 4-way crop rotation that 1 year I would use cover crops, and those cover crops would usually be a mixture of plants, including mustard. Sanitation is also important if you're working around your vegetable plants, and this is true for any other plants that you have. Sanitation is important. The disinfectant that's found to be the safest for plants itself is Lysol. Some people in the past have recommended bleach or Clorox. The bleach can have a negative effect on plant tissues, and so the best recommendation would be to use Lysol wipes if you're pruning or doing work around your disease plants or even normal plants. Go ahead and have these wipes available to use on your tools. So those are the vascular wilt diseases. Again, Fusarium, Verticillium, and Bacterial. Next, we're going to talk about bacterial foliar diseases. And we say foliar because these primarily start on the leaves, but as the pictures show here, they can show up on the fruit themselves. There's two, bacterial spot and bacterial speck. They're both caused by different types of bacteria. I've seen examples of this. They're doing a lot of research with these at the Mountain Research Center. I have a hard time telling them apart. I think a plant pathologist can probably tell you that one is spot and the other is speck, and I just kind of lump them together. The important things to remember about these bacteria is they are gram-negative bacteria that have a flagellum on the back. And if you think about the flagellum, it's kind of like a whip, almost like they have an outboard motor on the back of them, and so they can easily move within water. These are primarily introduced through contaminated seed. So the bacteria comes in on the seed and then is incorporated in the plant or into the soil and then available to infect the plant. Transplants or seedlings that you buy can be infected. If you buy seeds, sometimes you'll see catalogs that'll talk about that they are disease-free seed. So that's something to look for if you've had a problem in the past. Because of these bacteria having this kind of whip-like flagellum, they're able to move through moisture, high humidity, rain, dew. They're splash dispersed, and again, mechanical movements. If you're dealing with a diseased plant and you're using some type of tool, you can very easily move it from one plant to the next. Bacterial foliar diseases, the management, crop rotation, we just talked about. Sanitation, we've talked about. There are techniques if you don't know if you're getting disease-free seeds. There are techniques for disinfecting seeds, and we won't go through that today. There are available resources online for that. Again, either avoid wet foliage or avoid working with the tomatoes when it's wet. Removing plant debris. We're going to talk about solanaceous weeds. Solanaceous weeds are weeds that are in the same family as tomatoes. So those weeds can harbor these bacterial pathogens. And then there are some preventive sprays that we'll talk about in more detail. So solanaceous weeds, I'll just mention a couple that are fairly common in the environment. One is eastern black nightshade. I saw some of this in bloom a couple of weeks ago, so I know it's around. The other one that you may have seen is clammy ground cherry. It has an interesting yellow flower. You've probably seen this when it produces the seed. It's sort of like Chinese paper lanterns, kind of gets the seeds. These are probably two of the most common solanaceous weeds. You need to look for those if you have a garden that's near an area bordering on a woods area or bordering on a pasture or a field. You need to look for these. They're fairly common. And if you find them, try to get rid of them in proximity to your garden. These were not something that I considered very commonly in the past. Then when I found out that they could be harboring some of these pathogens for tomatoes, I started looking for them, and the more I look, the more I find them. What can we do from a chemical standpoint? One of the biggest things we can use are what are called fixed copper fungicides. Very first fixed copper fungicide was developed over 100 years ago in Bordeaux, France, now typically called Bordeaux mixture. It's copper sulfate that has been so-called fixed with hydrated lime. It was originally developed in the vineyards of Bordeaux to control mildew problems and other pathogens that they had. These are not only fungicides, but they can be bactericides as well. So they can be effective against both fungi and bacteria. I've listed here other examples of what are called fixed copper fungicides. If you start looking for copper solutions that we can use as home gardeners. I've given you some examples here. I don't endorse these products one way or the other. They're just good examples of what you might be able to purchase to use. Copper sulfate, again, this is a fixed copper sulfate, 3.9% copper. Copper soaps, 1.8% copper. And then the highest copper percentage that you can buy, copper diacetate, is 8%. The percentage of copper can be important for its activity. The higher the amount of copper, the higher the activity. And there are copper products that have a higher percentage of copper that are available for commercial use by commercial producers, but these are at least 3 examples of copper solutions that you might be able to find if you want to use it. The most important thing about copper and about many of the other agents we're going to talk about for chemical intervention is that they are really protectant fungicides and bactericides. So here where we see problems on the leaves and on the fruit, that's already a problem. Copper is not going to be beneficial in this situation. It's primarily used as a protectant, and the recommendation for commercial users are to apply it every 3 to 10 days when the disease threatens. For most of us as home growers, we're not going to know we have the problem until we actually see disease lesions. Copper can be effective as a protectant or a preventive, if you will, and oftentimes will not be very effective once you have overt signs of problems, as you see here. So those are the bacterial diseases, and the next group of diseases we'll talk about are the leaf spot diseases. One of the more common ones that we deal with is what's called early blight. We're going to talk about 3 different blights: early blight, late blight, and southern blight. This is early blight. It is primarily found in the soil, but it can also be harbored in plant debris. It's an alternaria fungal infection. And again, solanaceous plants could be a possible source as well. It can be confused early on with the bacterial spot and bacterial speck. So in my mind, the early blight, early blight, and bacterial spot and bacterial speck in the early situation look very similar. You probably need to have a trained professional be able to differentiate one from the other. This is a soil-borne disease. It carries over in plant debris. It's not very well spread airborne. So again, management, we'll talk about here in a few minutes some of the resistant hybrids that have been developed. Resistant hybrids is probably the most effective way to prevent this. We've talked about crop rotation. Again, this is a soil-borne disease, so crop rotation can be helpful. We've talked about mulch. So again, preventing a splash of soil onto the leaves might be helpful. If you have volunteers, if you have a large garden and you have some volunteer tomatoes that have come up, and this happens also in your compost pile, you need to remove those volunteers. They can come up through the soil and actually carry and harbor the organism. You can prune the bottom leaves of the tomato plant to keep them from touching the ground or being splashed. Removing plant debris where the organism may reside. Solanaceous weeds we've talked about. Somebody mentioned earlier about plants growing together, and so increasing airflow around the plant to hopefully not allow the plant to retain moisture. And again, chemical control primarily as a preventive or a protectant rather than after the disease has taken hold. These are the compounds that are generally recommended for early blight. Copper products that we talked about earlier, and neem oil, which is oftentimes used as an organic solution, has very limited efficacy. The 2 chemicals that are specifically used or discussed is chlorothalonil and mancozeb. I've used chlorothalonil in the past, and what I like about it, it has a 0-day waiting period, meaning you could spray your tomatoes this morning and go ahead and pick fruit this evening, go ahead and wash it off, but you don't have anything to worry about. Mancozeb is thought to have a better efficacy, but you can see it has a 5-day waiting period, so after you treat the plants, you can't really harvest fruit for another 5 days. Those are the 2 that are primarily recommended once you've seen evidence of leaf spot disease like early blight. Late blight is the thing that we worry about the most. You can see here the scientific name is Phytophthora infestans. Phytophthora in Greek means decay, ruin, or perish. Infestans comes from Latin meaning to infest or destroy. And you're probably all familiar with this organism because this is the same organism that caused the potato blight in Ireland in the 1840s and 50s. I guess I can thank the potato blight for me being here because I'm a quarter Irish and my Irish relatives came from Ireland to the United States in the 1840s and 50s fleeing the potato blight. That was this late blight. Not only tomatoes, but it can infest a variety of plants that are in the nightshade family. This shows evidence of, again, lesions on the leaves that can infect the fruit. And boy, there's just not much you can do for late blight. The problem is it's airborne and spores from this can travel over 10 miles. So you can have an infected plant 10 miles away and it may go ahead and infect your plants. Again, excessive water, so heavy dew, rain will enhance its spread. It has a tendency to be more active with cool, cloudy weather. This primarily goes away in the wintertime. The organism does not survive our winters, but it overwinters in Florida. And so what happens is about this time of year, as things warm up, the organism starts spreading airborne from Florida up through Georgia to us. So again, this is very little you can do once this takes hold. And the most important thing is to try to use resistant varieties if you're concerned about late blight. Both early and late blight and bacterial speck and spot, a lot of ongoing research at the Mountain Research Center about those conditions. The final blight we'll talk about is southern blight, also sometimes called southern wilt, southern stem rot, or southern root rot. It's another fungal organism that lives in the soil. What you'll see initially is that you'll see a rot of the stem right at the soil line. This can be very persistent in the soil. It's not a tomato disease that I've seen before and really wasn't in locations where I've grown tomatoes before, but it is something that can affect tomatoes here. And again, because it's soil-borne, crop rotation, avoiding previous sites, avoiding poor drainage, plant debris, it can sometimes be harbored in plant debris. Soil solarization may be helpful. Optimal soil pH, we talked about that earlier. Soil pH over 6 seems to be, the organism doesn't like that. So again, if we have our native soils and the pH is less than 5, getting that soil pH up above 6 may be helpful. Chemical control is very limited and there's certainly no organic way to do it. The only chemical, and it's quite a mouthful, is chloronitrobenzene, which doesn't sound organic at all. Soil drenches can be used in a commercial situation, but again, probably not something we're going to use as a home gardener. Root knot nematodes are microscopic worms that live in the soil. They do infect the roots and cause these nodules that can occur, and then we'll see a wilting condition above ground in the tomatoes. Again, crop rotation, very important. Fallowing or solarization may be helpful. And resistant varieties is probably the best way to handle this. You may have heard about root knot nematodes in relationship to marigolds. Marigolds are often touted as a companion planting to plant with a variety of vegetables and other plants. It's thought to be beneficial. There has been some research done with marigolds and root knot nematodes. All that research has been done in commercial situations where they took a field that had commercially grown tomatoes and where they had root knot nematode problems. The next year, they didn't grow any tomatoes there, and they grew nothing but marigolds. The marigolds have compounds within the roots and within the plant that are fatal to or will suppress the nematodes. And what they found is if they took this entire field and planted it to nothing but marigolds, that completely eliminated the nematode problem from that field. But there's no studies that I know of that if you intersperse marigolds around your tomato plants, that alone will be enough to suppress the nematodes. There are a number of different viral infections, and of course we're in the middle of our coronavirus pandemic, but there are a number of viruses that do affect tomatoes and some of our other vegetable crops. Similar to coronavirus, there aren't effective drugs or chemicals that we can use. The best way is to prevent these. Tomato spotted wilt virus is one of the more common viruses. It causes a very interesting, unique pattern on both the leaves and the fruit. This virus is actually transmitted from plant to plant by the western flower thrip, so by insect. The best way we can do is to try a good insect control, but also go ahead and plant resistant varieties. I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about hybrids and resistant varieties. Of course, with tomatoes over the last 15, 20 years, there's been a big resurgence in interest in heirloom tomatoes. Heirloom tomatoes can be great, but they can also be difficult to grow because the modern hybrids, many of them have bred into them resistance against many of the diseases that we're talking about today. So I just wanted to mention a couple of the hybrids that I think you may want to look at if you're interested in disease resistance. One of my favorite hybrids is called Celebrity. If you buy a Celebrity transplant or a seedling, or if you buy the seed, you're going to see a whole series of letters after the name. Those letters in most of the catalogs on the transplant will correspond to disease resistance. You can see here VFF-NTAST. V is verticillium wilt, meaning that there's verticillium wilt resistance. Fusarium wilt, there are actually 3 races, 1, 2, and 3. So you'll see FF or FFF, and those are the different types of Fusarium. You can see Celebrity is nematode resistant, and then it's resistant to another virus we haven't talked about and a couple of other fungal and bacterial pathogens. I recommend Celebrity for people that have never grown tomatoes before. If they're going to grow tomatoes for the first time, whether it be in a container or in the ground, I think the Celebrity hybrid is a great way to go. I think it's a good tasting tomato, and it's a good example of one that is resistant to several of the problems that we've talked about. Then there's the Mountain Series. This is Dr. Randy Gardner. Met Dr. Gardner before. He's now retired. He's a professional emeritus at the Mountain Horticulture Crops Research and Extension Center near Mills River. He's still involved in some of the tomato trials, and over the last 30 years, he's been instrumental in developing the so-called Mountain Series of hybrids. I think it's interesting that these are hybrids that were actually developed right here in the mountains of western North Carolina. A number of these Mountain Series of hybrids are available on the market, either to grow it from seed or available as seedlings. You're even going to find some now in the grocery store. I found a Mountain Series of tomato in Ingalls earlier this week. One of the things that Dr. Gardner's worked on within the Mountain Series is to try to breed in disease resistance to several of these blight conditions that we talked about. I'm just going to show you a couple of these. He talked about these at the tomato field days last year. Mountain Magic is an indeterminate variety that has good early blight resistance and excellent late blight resistance. Dr. Gardner and his colleagues have found that the pH2 and pH3 genes provide late blight resistance. They've bred those genes into several of these tomatoes. Mountain Merit is a good one for containers. It's a determinate. It has excellent late blight resistance. So again, it has the pH2 and pH3 genes. And you can see it also has resistance against verticillium. FFF means that it's resistant against the 3 races of Fusarium, nematodes, and then the wilt virus that we talked about earlier that's spread by thrips. I think there's a place for looking to plant and raise hybrid tomatoes versus heirlooms, and these are some examples of tomatoes that were developed locally and you might think about including in your garden. If you look in catalogs, there are now a number of other late blight resistant varieties. Again, once late blight hits your tomato, there's not much you can do, so we really need to think about prevention, and it's really impossible to decrease the airborne exposure of the plant. And again, Old Brooks, we talked about earlier, as being somewhat resistant to blossom end rot. Defiant is one that I know a lot of people have grown around here locally that has good late blight resistance as well. So as you're purchasing your transplants or as you're purchasing seeds, look for these types of varieties. A couple more things before we finish up. Hornworms are a pretty dramatic problem that you might see. They're basically caterpillars from two different types of moths that are pictured here. They can be pretty active, completely denuding a plant. Probably hand picking is the best way to deal with them. You can use Stillus thuringiensis, which is a bacterial organism that will affect them. And then if you find one that has these little white structures on them, there is a parasitic wasp that will go ahead and inject its eggs. And you can probably just leave that one alone because those wasp larvae are going to hatch and go ahead and kill the hornworm. Spider mites. This is an area where they're doing quite a bit of research at the Mountain Horticulture Research Center. It can be a problem not only in tomatoes, but a variety of other vegetables as well as ornamental plants. And you'll typically see kind of white speckling on the leaves, although the mites prefer to live on the underside of the leaf. You can see here in the upper right-hand picture, they get their names because they sort of look like spiders, and they can sometimes kind of weave a white web. I think the easiest way, if you have this on tomatoes or other plants, is just to take a piece of white paper, put it underneath the leaf, just tap the leaf fairly aggressively, and whatever falls off the underside of the leaf, you can look at it and you'll see little brown specks rapidly moving around. So my question in the chat box is, are spider mites insects?
Well, it looks like we're a bit divided. No and yes. We actually have, no, they have 8 legs.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. They have 8 legs. So they are not insects. One of the things at the tomato field days last year I was most interested in is they're doing a lot of research on how to control spider mites, which can be a big problem, especially in commercial setups. One of the things they're finding is that after you use a broad spectrum insecticide with the tomatoes, they would have a flare, meaning they would have a dramatic increase in the number of spider mites that were infesting the plant. What they found is a broad spectrum insecticide, usually we're using it to try to control a pathogen, but if you use it inappropriately, it kills many of the beneficial insects that actually naturally control spider mites. And so they will go through and they'll spray. They're actually doing this under experimental conditions. They'll take the tomatoes, spray them on purpose with an insecticide, and then what they'll see is that the spider mite numbers go up tremendously, what they call a flare. So just be concerned, and we talked earlier about integrated pest management, IPM, and we have a tendency to always think about a biotic problem and what we can spray. And so we oftentimes very much start with some type of insecticidal spray without knowing what the problem is, and we can actually make things worse. Part of the problems with spider mites is they have a tendency to live on the underside surface of the leaf. Hard water streams can be effective in just knocking them off and knocking the eggs. But again, it can be very difficult. There are actually some wands that are made specifically to try to get up underneath. Neem oil can be one organic option, but again, it can be difficult. You need to make sure that you get up underneath the leaf. One of the research they're doing out at the Mountain Research Center is what they call trap crops. They use what they call banker beans. And basically what they found is that bush beans, if they plant those near the tomatoes, that spider mites prefer the bean plants over the tomatoes. In a way, you're using that to trap the mites. So they will accumulate on the banker crop, if you will, or the trap crop, and then you can control that and not worry about them being on your tomatoes. They have ongoing research. They were doing a lot with the trap crop research last year. One of the reasons I'm interested in going to the tomato field days this year, even though it's virtual, is to see if they will share some of the results from that. They were getting some very encouraging results. For us in the home garden, we want our bush beans too. And so not necessarily having the mite go to the beans instead of the tomatoes, but they might be able to find that there are some trap crops that are helpful to control spider mites in a home garden situation. I thought it was very interesting research, especially that the indiscriminate or inappropriate use of insecticides could actually make some of our disease problems worse. Stink bugs will a variety of different crops. I used to grow a lot of pumpkins, and one of my biggest pest problems with pumpkins were the brown stink bug. They do have a piercer, and they will pierce the leaves and suck off the fluids there and pierce the fruit, and it shows some of those. And these can be very difficult to control with organic sprays. If you have this, you want to go ahead and treat early rather than trying to treat a full-blown infestation. What's called the tomato fruit worm is actually the same thing that you will probably most commonly see in sweet corn. We also call it the corn earworm. It's the caterpillar or the larval form here you can see of a moth species. We'll most typically see that in sweet corn, but just realize that it can, if the moth lays the eggs on the tomato fruit, they will go ahead and burrow into tomatoes as well. Finally, other pests. Birds were mentioned earlier, and certainly birds can attack both green and ripe fruit. Probably using mechanical nets is probably the best way. My biggest pest when she was alive was a miniature schnauzer named Annie. Annie loved tomatoes, and when I would let her out, the first thing she would do is run to the tomato plant and find the ripest tomato and pull it off. So my biggest wildlife pest over the year was a dog. Certainly squirrels, groundhogs, there are a variety of other pests that will get into the tomatoes as well. The final comment, although it doesn't relate to problems now, is storing tomato cages. In the past, I would typically use some type of a tomato cage for my tomatoes. I had a large property with a couple of barns, and I would just store them inside the barns. And then some research came out that said that at the end of the season, you should take your tomato cage, you should thoroughly clean it and wash it off as best you can, and then you should store it outdoors. The reason for that is the ultraviolet light, even in the wintertime, is intense enough that it will oftentimes kill many of the pathogens that may overwinter on your cage. We talked about getting rid of plant debris, but this is another place where organisms can sometimes hold over from one year to the next. So I stopped keeping my cages in the basement or in the garage or in the barn and actually left them outside where they received that sunlight all winter. That's the current recommendation. The final thing I'll say, I just want to share with you, these are kind of interesting, the tomato records in North America. The heaviest single tomato fruit that's ever been recorded, at least by Guinness, was from a variety called Delicious, and the tomato weighed 7 3/4 pounds. The longest plant was Sungold, which is actually a cherry tomato variety. It grew to be 65 feet long. The largest plant no longer exists. At the time, this is about 10 years ago, was at Walt Disney World. It was called a tomato tree. It was grown at Disney World from seeds that they obtained from China. And in its lifetime, it produced 32,000 tomatoes, over 1,150 pounds of tomatoes from one single plant. There's your little bit of trivia for the day. Just remind you that the garden helpline is available either by phone or by email. There's master gardeners there 3 times a week. You can either call during that time frame or email questions that you have. Hopefully one of the Extension Master Gardener volunteers will answer that for you.
Thank you, Phil. If you go to buncombemastergardener.org, it's the website for the Extension Master Gardeners here in Buncombe County, and look under events, you'll find our calendar for more gardening in the mountains and other online seminars. Thank you so much for joining us.